Good morning. Harry, to say you were a little upset was like to say the Titanic took on a little water. Before I begin this morning, I have a reading from George Bernard Shaw. This is the true joy in life, being used for a purpose recognized by yourself as a mighty one, being a force of nature instead of a feverish, selfish little clod of ailments and grievances, complaining that the world does not devote itself to making you happy. I am of the opinion that my life belongs to the whole community, and as long as I live, it is my privilege to do for it what I can. I want to be thoroughly used up when I die, for the harder I work, the more I live. I rejoice in life for its own sake. Life is no brief candle to me. It is a sort of splendid torch that I have got to hold on to for a moment, and I want to make it burn as brightly as possible before handing it on to future generations. My topic this morning is a fierce and tender concern for the self. Contrary to popular belief, there's a strong likelihood that our ancestors were as smart as we like to think we are, and that their reasoning power was just as well developed. Therefore, how often do we take time to acknowledge the thousands of teachers who have felt compelled to write down their wisdom for the benefit of anyone who would dare read? Though we may live in the 21st century, we have the uncommon ability and the privilege of sharing the thoughts of people who lived hundreds, even thousands of years before we entered this human stage. Wisdom is never contained in a simple book, regardless of what authoritarians may claim. And personally, I will say, I've always been a little suspect of anybody that only has one book. One book containing all the wisdom needed would just be too remarkable. We must therefore spread our wings and dance through the pages of time by turning the pages of books. Now, I must confess that over time, as technology gets smaller and smaller and smaller, I seem to require that the letters get larger and larger and larger. Many have gone before us, but they have been able to impart their wisdom to us if we just read and listen. It is a wonderful safari to read through the pages written by forgotten sages and to compare their ideas with sages from other epochs. In a way, that's what we will do today. We will explore the importance of taking care of the self. There's an old Eastern proverb that says, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. I'm surprised how often that has happened to me in my life. For example, I will read something that doesn't really click with me at the time, but later, under different circumstances, that same reading will have a profound effect on me. My teachers have often been sages from other ages. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., the physician and the writer, said, "The best way to ensure a long and productive life is to have a chronic disease and take care of it." When I first read that, I was young and invulnerable. I was going to live forever. It wasn't until I got much older and was diagnosed with a life-threatening illness that I began to understand those words. What caused the change? I think the answer to that question is that I became aware of time. Once a person becomes aware of time, they become aware of their own mortality. That single realization can cause a person to develop a fierce and tender concern for the self. Concern for the self indicates some level of self-love. When a person can finally fall in love with the self, it is the beginning of a lifelong romance with all of humanity. There is, however, a profound distinction between self-love and self-centeredness. How do we express love or caritas for all without becoming depreciating or egocentric? Perhaps the answer lies in Shakespeare's words, and I quote, "Above all, to thine own self be true," close quote. One thing that has always interested me is how religious approaches of self-love and caritas manifest. There are some differences between Occidental and Oriental approaches in religious philosophy, and I'd like to explore a couple of these differences this morning. There's a profound difference in these two philosophical approaches of life and one's relationship to the eternal. I think the first thing that struck me as a young person studying these was the fact that the Western view of religion, we seem more able to separate our philosophy of life from our philosophy of religion. We seem to be able to compartmentalize and parcel these things out, and we don't consider it a violation if they don't conform. The first major differences in these two philosophical approaches in the Eastern religion, one is asked to rid themselves of the ego, whereas in Western thought, one is asked to tune and train the ego. The idea here is that we should be able to train and tune the ego so when it's our time to leave, we're able to hand back the ego to God in its best possible condition. Early Western monks saw the ego as a sense of self as opposed to the idea of egocentrism. In Western thought, it is thought that you do better. It is better to do good than it is to feel good. In Eastern thought, it was just the reverse. The internal thought and resolution and enlightenments are considered much more important in the East than what you do. There are some interesting teaching stories from both perspectives that we should take a look at. First, from the Western view. St. John of the Cross said, and I quote, If you are in an ecstasy as deep as St. Paul, and a sick man needed a cup of soup, it is better for you to return from the ecstasy for love's sake and bring him a cup of soup. Ignatius of Loyola, the hermit priest in the 1500s, put it this way: how much more in God's sight is one act of charity performed by the will than all the visions and ecstasies they receive from heaven, close quote. There's a wonderful teaching story from the medieval period. It seems that a monk in a European monastery wanted more than anything else to see a vision of the Virgin Mary while meditating. By the way, in early Buddhist religion, you were considered enlightened if you saw the Buddha with a light behind his head. It is also true that in very early Western religion, to see a vision of the Virgin Mary might have been considered idolatry. Anyway, the ancient story goes like this. There was a monk who spent his entire life in prayer and meditation, hoping for a vision of the Virgin Mary. One day while meditating, the vision appeared. However, just as it appeared, the bell rang at the back door of the monastery. It was this monk's job to feed the loaves of bread to the poor who had gathered there. He was in turmoil. His vision finally came, but he felt obligated to do his job. He apologized to the vision and he ran off to feed the poor. Later he returned dejected and heartsick, but much to his surprise, the vision was still there. He once again apologized profusely, but the vision stopped him. And the vision said, "If thou had stayed, I must have fled." Eastern thought does not reject the idea of loving care and helping, but it focuses mainly on the self-search. The view in the East is that we are all a part of the whole, but we must find our own separate pathways to the eternal. This is done through thought and prayer, intuition and meditation. We must delve deeply into our own inner space to reach our core. No matter how much we do for others, we must be at peace in the center of our being. Notice how the Bhagavad Gita is similar in ways to Rudyard Kipling's poem, If. Kipling says, triumph or disaster, treat those two impostors just the same. In the Gita it says, one to me is shame or fame. One to me is joy or pain. One to me is loss or gain. Both of these proclaim that most of us buy into life's illusions rather than focusing on life's essence. In the East, the quest for things, the quest for recognition, and the quest for power are false quests. They are distractions from the important task of unity with the eternal. They view materialism as myth, and chasing power is like chasing ghosts. Lao Tzu, the author of the Tao in the 4th century before Jesus, saw the universe as whole, the one. He taught his followers to seek oneness, that is, being the same, at peace person with others in all situations. Whether you endorse Eastern or Western view or some combination of the two, there is some common ground. They both promote tuning and training of the self, the mind, the ego. They both promote turning away from the trappings of society, materialism, competition, and violence. It is, however, so easy to get trapped in the mind's whirlwinds, trying to decide what to do, how to do, what do we achieve, what goals do we chase. But in the end, if we are to be healthy, we must choose to protect, love, and care for the self in order to care for others. Too often we end up in conflict and we're confused. Trying to decide makes our brain seem like that they're screaming at us, like there's an angry committee in our head taking at least two different sides to the issue. Plato talked about the human mind as being like a mutiny at sea with the captain locked below. The captain must ultimately regain control and guide the ship to safety. The Roman mystic Plotinus compared the mind to a choir before the choirmaster arrives. Ultimately, it is our mind, and we must take charge and guide ourselves through both the good and the turbulent times. Yes, again, the Bard of Avon cautions us, quote, above all, to thine own self be true. There's a great story about Rabbi Zusha, the 18th century Hasidic rabbi, that emphasizes the importance of being true to the self. Rabbi Zusha was once asked by his congregation to take a stand on a particular political issue. He refused to do it because it was against his conscience. He refused, and his congregation got very angry with him, and they confronted him saying, if Moses were here, he would do it. Zusha thought for a moment, and then he said to them, when I stand before God, he will not say to me, Zusha, why were you not Moses? He will say to me, Zusha, why were you not Zusha? In the face of hostility, Zusha exhibited a fierce and tender concern for himself. Isaac Luria, the 16th century Kabbalic mystic, wrote, there are over 600,000 words in the Torah. These symbolize the 600,000 paths that are available for all human beings. The message in the metaphor is that we must each find our own path, and there are many ways to fiercely protect and care for the self. We must each find our own song, our own dance, our own rhythm, our own bliss. But the operative words here are our own. Learning to do our own dance without being led by guilt and fear is an awesome task. But our sages all tell us to dance, 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 laugh and dance. St. Thomas Aquinas saw our relationship with the self and the eternal in this way. And he said, I quote, anything you do which is good for your own individuality is also good for your relationship to God, close quote. Determining what is good for you is the hard part. remember that the healthy person is the person willing to do the difficult things that are good for them. I spent 30 years trying to get people to do the difficult things that were good for them. It was harder for me than it was for them. I am sure that many of you have heard the medieval story of the juggler of Notre Dame. But if you haven't, it goes like this. There was an itinerant juggler named Barnaby who became a monk. And during the time of King Louis, it was customary to present the statue of the Virgin Mary with a gift during the festival of Notre Dame. Barnaby had nothing to give except his juggling. After juggling in front of the statue, he was arrested and accused of blasphemy. It was a crime for which the penalty was death. As he was being taken away, the Virgin Mary statue stepped down from her pedestal, and she said to her accusers, "He gave me his all. Did you?" Giving is critical to life. However, we must be willing to both give and receive. The essence of giving is the giving of yourself. Far too often we want to give things we want to get things without significant work on our part. We are evolving creatures, and evolution takes hard work. I remember a friend of mine who was, and I suppose remains, shall we say, financially naive. So I purchased and gave to him a book and a cassette course on managing personal finances. His response to me was he was too busy and he didn't have time to read the book or listen to the cassette tapes. Why didn't I just tell him what was on there quickly so he could do it? This showed me he had too little concern for the self. Human beings seldom have transcendental changes. Life is slow and evolving. We seem to want everything now, whatever it is. We seldom want to let our enlightenment come about through some progressive process. We are certainly unlike the early monks who spent their entire life training their abilities to love and care. These medieval monks were usually called athletes of God. There are people around us who go from Zen to yoga to meditation to jazzercise to jogging or some other interest without ever asking themselves, how will this help me to evolve, to expand, to grow, to be a better person? I call these people the groupies of the latest fad. The mystic teacher Gurdjieff said, and I quote, "It is impossible to give a man anything that would be his inalienable property without work on his part," close quote. My favorite quote on the topic comes from a well-known meditation teacher, Sri Min Choi. He said, quote, "Most people will do anything for their own advancement, but work for it," close quote. A fierce and tender concern for the self primarily involves love. Love seems to be the necessary and sufficient soul food for life. If you remember the famous reminder in Leviticus to love others as thyself, I remind you, it does not say to love them better than thyself, to love them as thyself. St. John of the Cross, the writer and Spanish mystic, wrote, quote, "In the evening of your life, you shall be judged by love," close quote. A couple of years before he died, Sigmund Freud was talking with one of his disciples, J.C. Flegel. And at some point in the discussion, Flegel asked, "We've been working together for some time. Answer me this one question. How does psychoanalysis cure the patient?" Freud thought for a moment, and then in a very un-Freudian answer, he said, "At one point in the analytic process, the analyst loves the patient, and the patient knows it, and the patient is cured." What does it mean to love another person? I think that it has something to do with allowing that person to be themselves. And so to love the self would naturally follow letting the self be the self. The psychic healer Agnes Sanford wrote, "Only love can generate the healing fire." If she is correct, and I think that's highly possible, that a fierce and tender love for the self will potentiate our own healing. And our own healing will potentiate that moment of absolute purity of love for not only the self, but for others. Now, before all of this talk about self-love begins to sound like artificial sweetener, I would remind you that St. Teresa of Avila said, quote, "Oh God, save us from sober and serious saints," close quote. The mystic Sufi Pierre Vilar Khan said, "Judge your gurus by how much fun they have in life," close quote. I think we can not only have a fierce and tender concern for the self, but we need to have heavy doses of laughter. I think we must have laughter in order to be healthy. We cannot ignore the wisdom of antiquity. So it is good to rejoice in the words of those sages. With that, I will leave you with one last quote about love. And if you are in the process of developing that fierce and tender concern for the self, and at the same time pursue your intentions and desires, this quote may be of value. It is a quote by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, the Jesuit priest, paleontologist, scientist, and philosopher who lived in the last part of the 17th century. And he said, "Someday, after we have mastered the wind, the waves, the tide, and gravity, we shall harness for God the energies of love, and then, for the second time in history of the world, man will have discovered fire." For each of you, I wish you to find your own way to acquire a fierce and tender concern for yourself. Thank you.